Thank you. So 5 years ago at BlackHat 2017, we talked about Indestroyer, the first ever malware specifically designed to attack power grids. And we labeled it the biggest threat to ICS since Stuxnet. And today, we present the sequel, Indestroyer 2. But before we get to that, we'll put this latest attack into context and go over the selection of the attacks by the APT group behind it. We'll do a recap of the original Indestroyer, so we'll also be comparing those two versions. We'll discuss the 2022 incident, how it unfolded, and take a closer look at the Indestroyer 2 malware. We also look at some other malware that was deployed alongside with it. And then we will end the presentation with some defense and detection advice. So I'm Robert Lipovsky. My co-speaker is Anton Cherepanov, and we're both threat researchers for ESET. Anton's specialization is advanced threats and APT attacks, research into these areas. And I also look at APTs mostly, but not only those, also crimeware, a bit of vulnerability research. For example, at BlackHat 2020, I co-presented our research on the Crook Wi-Fi vulnerability. But that was virtual, so it's really good to be back in person this time. ESET, for any of you that are not familiar with the company, so we've been on the market for over 3 decades, and we're the largest endpoint security provider based in the European Union, specifically in Slovakia, which is right next to Ukraine, by the way. And what you'll hear today is our original research. I mean, we have a unique vantage point as the most widely used security vendor in Ukraine. Many private and public sector organizations use our software, giving us direct telemetry, and we see that the attacks unraveling in real time. But it's not, as you notice, it's not just us two, because we have a very special guest today, directly from Ukraine, Mr. Viktor Zhora, who's the deputy chairman of the State Service of Special Communications. Who's the chairman of SSS CIP in Ukraine, and he's overseen the incident response to the Indestroyer 2 attack. So he is definitely one of the best people to share very valuable insight on the incident, so it's a pleasure to have him here with us. So the cyber war in Ukraine didn't start this February. It started in 2014, or perhaps even towards the end of 2013. And here's a list of the most notable APT groups that have carried out targeted attacks against Ukraine over those years. Mind you, this is not a comprehensive list either. This is just a selection that we made. And from this selection, we will focus on, in my opinion, the most aggressive of these groups, the one behind the power grid attacks, Sandworm. Sandworm has been attributed to the Russian Military Intelligence Service, GRU, and in October 2020, the FBI even released a public indictment of 6 GRU hackers for taking part in some of the campaigns and attacks we'll be discussing next. By the way, if anyone is wondering where the name Sandworm comes from, here's the answer. In some of the early campaigns using the Black Energy malware, we discovered these text strings in the command and control server addresses. So apparently, the operators were fans of Frank Herbert's classic. And we first talked about these Dune references at the Virus Bulletin conference in 2014. But it was actually Eyesight Partners, now under Mandiant, that coined the Sandworm name. So we've been tracking them from the beginning, since Black Energy actually evolved from a cyber criminal commodity piece of malware to a cyber weapon in the hands of Sandworm. And looking into our telemetry, the earliest Sandworm traces we could find there dates to 2011. And here's one decoy document that was being used at the time, referencing a conference early the following year. Then, as I indicated, towards the end of 2013, we observed a notable increase in targeted APT activity against Ukrainian high-value targets, so preceding the Russian occupation of Crimea and the beginning of the war in Donbass. Sandworm targeted all types of organizations, including government, diplomatic, media, transportation, even the Ukrainian elections. One of the main methods they used to infiltrate organizations was through carefully crafted, really highly targeted spearphishing emails. And here's one example that's even using the war in Donbass as a lure. The email says that the Ukrainian Prime Minister is instructing various state institutions to check every parliament member for supporting separatists in the East, and that in the attached file, there was a PowerPoint presentation with this list of alleged separatist supporters. So as you can see, this is some really good social engineering here. This is not your common Nigerian print scam. And in the background, Black Energy would be downloaded and installed from a remote server. Also, this exploited a zero-day vulnerability in PowerPoint. So even recipients could have been compromised even if they had fully patched versions of Windows and Office. So Black Energy was used in many campaigns against many organizations in Ukraine. But for sure, the most notable attack, and the one that caught the attention of the global cybersecurity industry, was the one against the Ukrainian power grid, which culminated in December 2015, when it became the first ever blackout caused by a cyber attack. It was facilitated by the Black Energy malware and carried out against multiple electric distribution companies in various regions across the country, so-called oblenergos. And the attackers misused remote access software to manually switch off the flow of electricity, and as a result, the homes of over 200,000 Ukrainians across the country, different regions, went dark for several hours. Here's an infamous leaked video taken by one of the operators at one of those targeted substations, showing how the attackers are remotely connecting to this workstation and interacting with the SCADA software there, manipulating circuit breakers, and showing that, look, no one is touching the mouse or the keyboard. Almost exactly 1 year later, in December 2016, there was another blackout, again caused by a cyber attack, and this time the attackers really stepped up their game. There were quite a number of notable differences. For example, only one substation was hit. But the main difference is that the attackers had much bigger ambitions. We discovered the malware that they deployed in Destroyer. And unlike the previous year's manual disruption through Radmin, Destroyer was the first ever malware that was specifically designed to attack the power grids in an automated way. That's the keyword here, and we'll come back to that later. So in the following years after that, there was a lot of evolution of the tool set used by Sandworm. And the group split its activities. We were tracking the gray energy cluster, which continued attacks against the energy sector. And there was the telebots cluster, which carried out attacks primarily against the financial sector in Ukraine. And telebots was also the subgroup behind the infamous NotPetya outbreak in June 2017, which obviously needs no introduction, and I won't go any detail on what became the most devastating and costly cyber attack in history. I'll just mention and give credit to Anton, who discovered the origin or the patient zero of the outbreak and found out that it originated from a supply chain compromise of MEDoc, and therefore made the attribution link that NotPetya was the work of Sandworm as well. In 2018, we discovered a telebots backdoor called Xeramel, and the significance of this is that after 1.5 years, this was the first hard evidence for attributing Destroyer to Sandworm based on code similarity. So all of these conclusions that we're making, all of these links, putting together pieces of the puzzle, we have to actually back them up with clues, code similarities, execution chains, shared network infrastructure, and so on. Then in the following years, we saw Sandworm attacks in Ukraine, but also in other countries. There was Olympic Destroyer in Korea, Gray Energy also in Poland, Sandtime in Georgia, Turkey. Exaramel was also found in France. So the GRU attackers continued to be active, but they kept a much lower profile. They were no longer, in mainstream media like the years before, until now. On February 23rd this year, just before 5 p.m. Ukrainian time, which is just a few hours before the Russian military invasion, we detected attacks by malware called Hermetic Wiper in Ukraine. And not expecting what would happen the next morning, obviously, but with the escalations and the Russian army stationed at the Ukrainian border, we felt that this discovery was something that shouldn't be reserved for our private threat intel customers only, but we wanted to share it with the community, and we did that in this Twitter thread. Hermetic Wiper was found on hundreds of systems in multiple organizations, and it was a pure act of cyber sabotage. So it was trying to render the computers in these organizations unbootable, and in effect, any public-facing services inaccessible. And it was only the first in a series of wipers that we discovered in Ukraine since February, and their technical level varied, and Wiper was one of the more advanced ones. One notable feature that I'll mention is that it was abusing a driver of legitimate disk partitioning software for its low-level file system operations. The compilation timestamp suggests that the malware was prepared at least several months before it was deployed. But Hermetic Wiper wasn't the only malware used in this campaign. There was a worm that we are calling Hermetic Wizard for spreading across the network. There was Hermetic Ransom, which is FAW ransomware like NotPetya. By the way, one of the components in Hermetic Wizard was named by the attacker's Romance DLL, probably a reference to Eternal Romance, even though no exploits were actually used in this case. And if you think about it, it's kind of strange to employ a wiper and a decoy ransomware, which are essentially doing the same thing, right, in one campaign. Moreover, Hermetic Ransom was poorly written in contrast to Hermetic Ransom, poorly written compared to Hermetic Wiper. And one possible explanation for that is that the malware was being deployed through group policy. So the machines would download it at different times as they were being turned on. And the attackers probably tried to deploy Hermetic Ransom after they discovered that we were detecting and blocking Hermetic Wiper. Here's the ransom message displayed by Hermetic Ransom. And here are some Easter eggs found in the code. Then on March 14th, we discovered another wiper, Wiper. And I won't go into the detail, and I also won't be covering all of every wiper attack, because we discovered quite a few since February. But I encourage you to check out a broader presentation on the Ukrainian cyber war by Jags and Tom Hegel this afternoon. But I'll stick with Wiper for just a second, because it was notable because we later saw it again in the InDestroyer 2 incident. So this March 14th attack was targeting organizations in the financial sector. And from a technical point of view, it's not too interesting. One notable thing I'll mention is that it was avoiding destroying data on domain controllers, to retain access inside organizations while still disrupting operations. Okay. Now on to the events of April 8. So we were contacted by CERT UA to help them respond to a cyber incident at an energy provider and to help them analyze a suspicious piece of malware. And our analysis found that the threat was bigger than expected. It was a new version of Indestroyer, something which we haven't seen for the past 5 years. On a positive note, while the first Indestroyer incident caused a blackout lasting around 1 hour, this latest one didn't even accomplish that. So the attack was thwarted thanks to a prompt response by the defenders at the targeted Energo company, the work of CERT UA, and our assistance. But although no blackout took place, it was still a big deal. Because had the attack been successful, theoretically, more than 2 million people could have been left in the dark, since the targeted Energo is the provider of electricity in a region with that many people. So, in our opinion, this was the most significant cyber attack, even if unsuccessful, during the war thus far. And now, I will pass over the microphone to Victor to share his insights on the incident.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Anton, for kindly letting me join you in this presentation. It's a privilege for me to be at the BlackHat for the very first time. And second, I would like to express my gratitude to all partners who continue to support us in this unprecedented war, in our struggle for existence. This is perhaps the biggest challenge from World War II for the whole world, and it continues to be completely new in cyberspace. A lot of our, I would say this word, cyber friends continue to support us and provide assistance with software, hardware, clouds, consultancy service, and threat intelligence. I wouldn't name these companies, most of them are here, but two of them, ESET and Microsoft, historically have gained the largest coverage on Ukrainian networks and endpoints, and this allows them to continue being two major telemetry providers in Ukraine. And ESET worked hardly for 20 years to gain this coverage, and as Robert mentioned, ESET contributed to the first Indestroyer case in 2016. As most of the audience are familiar with, the number of cyber incidents tripled in the first months of war. But, however, the community, the experts, and Ukrainian cyber defenders were expecting for significantly more sophisticated incidents and cyber attacks. There are a number of reasons why it didn't happen so, but in the end of March and in the beginning of April, we faced with a number of really huge incidents, and one is Indestroyer 2. So, but up to the moment, since the beginning of the year, we registered 1,600 major cyber incidents and 1,074 from February 24th. So most of these attackers are focusing critical infrastructure and government agencies. And based on experience we gained from the last 8 years of cyber aggression against Ukraine, we continue being very attentive to all tips we receive regarding the energy sector. It's our privilege for CERT UA having a lot of communication, a lot of cooperation with many cyber intelligence providers, and it's been a big privilege for me to have direct contacts with key makers in cyber intelligence companies who can quickly send us tips if anything serious is happening. And that was the exact case when we received tips from Microsoft and from ESET. And we immediately reached the victim. to check whether there are false positives or not. And when we received this confirmation from them that there are potential issues, we gained access to the network and started providing incident response. And we discovered lately that perhaps the initial compromise happened even before February 17th. I will say just a few words explaining why this operation is so complex. So it's not about Indestroyer 2, this malware specifically designed for the ICS. It's a well-planned and technically sophisticated operation with a lot of tools we later discovered. For example, load maze malware for Windows workstations with an algorithm which is waiting for letter Z. Letter Z has become a symbol of the invasion. We also discovered malware operator backdoor specifically designed for FreeBSD and for Linux servers. And so we saw that attackers used a lot of wiper scripts like awful shred, solo shred, and the orchestrator org shred to clean the logs of their presence. And the same was done for Windows workstations. The overall idea was to provide this blackout in the end of Friday. So the scheduler was pre-configured for 5:58 p.m., expecting when most of administrative staff and all workstations are still on, and the staff is speaking their things going home. So this blackout would cause a serious impact on up to 2 million people, which Robert just mentioned. The overall impact we can just imagine. So there is Friday evening, and with the weekend it is coming soon, and people watching TV, watching news. This is exactly with the middle of active phase of invasion. So we consider this to be a kind of supportive operation to a lot of conventional operations that happen each day. And this is a totally destructive action, focusing on completely civilian infrastructure, to our point of view. And Anton will later go through all these sophisticated tools that were used together with Indestroyer 2, focusing on ICS component. But the idea was to switch and to wiper all the infrastructure. But these attackers missed one very important thing, that Friday is a short working day, and most of people end their work at 5 p.m. or even 4 p.m. So, and 5:58 or 95% of workstations were switched off. So they weren't wiped, and this allowed us to get a full picture. And after gaining an access to network, it took less than 12 hours for us to come to initial conclusions and share IOCs of Indestroyer 2 with 5 selected partner companies, just to add these IOCs to their database. And it's an interesting case and completely different story why it was published in the press. So it was posted to the press and even was posted on Twitter, this TLP Amber document which we shared with our partners. And that was one of the reasons we decided to organize a presser, invite the Deputy Minister of Energy to this and share this story to the world. To our opinion, this is important for community, and this is an act of aggression against civilian infrastructure, another one act of aggression from Russia's side in this hybrid war and cyber aggression. And that basically allowed a lot of companies making their brilliant reports on Indestroyer, like ISAT, Cisco Thales. These 2 companies help us in incident response. Mandiant, Microsoft, and many others So that's it. Robert, back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. That was very insightful. So let's continue with a quick recap of the original first version of Indestroyer. And it was unique, not only because it was the first malware specifically designed to attack power grids, but also it was only the second ever malware deployed to cause physical damage to industrial hardware, the first being Stuxnet, and then the third afterwards being Triton. So its first goal was to de-energize power lines, to open circuit breakers at a preset time using one of its payload modules, and we'll show the architecture in just a second. Secondly, the attackers would wipe SCADA software so that operators couldn't see the status of the environment. They couldn't control it. And that was supposed to be done by the wiper component that you can see here. So you can see that Sandworm has a really long history of wiping malware. And this module specifically wipes files belonging to SCADA software and then makes the control station unbootable by corrupting its critical files and crashing it and rebooting it, and it wouldn't boot. Third, Indestroyer would attempt to take out protection relays. And these play a really important role because they are there to protect the power grid from harmful conditions. And if disabled, the grid could potentially become vulnerable. And that was supposed to be done by the denial of service module. It was trying to exploit a vulnerability in Siemens Cybertech devices by sending a specially crafted UDP packet to port 50,000, which would switch the protection relay into a firmware update mode where it would be stuck and effectively not doing its job. Then the utility operators would attempt to restore power, reclose the breakers manually, and if the protective relays had been disabled, the grid could become unstable and possibly lead to even physical damage of hardware. So had this been successful, it wasn't, but had it been, the outage could have lasted much longer than it did. So the Russians had higher ambitions in the Indestroyer attack, but failed, in part because of better resilience of the Ukrainian defenders based on experience from the year prior to this, and in part because of coding mistakes that the attackers made. Here's a quick look at the architecture. It's a modular framework. There's a launcher component that's responsible for timing the attack, and it has a hard-coded time when to launch those payload modules that implemented 4 different industrial communication protocols that you can see listed there. Most of these were DLLs, each with their own configuration files. And I'll focus on IEC 104, as that's the one that's also used in Indestroyer 2. So the protocol itself is a network extension of IEC 101, a telecontrol protocol used in power grids. Now, it's extensive. No need to go into details. The important thing and the problem is that it was designed decades ago without focusing on security. There is no authentication. It operates using a client-server model. So the control station is the client, the remote station is the server. And what the malware is doing is that it's creating and transmitting so-called ASDU messages to change the state of the remote station IOAs, information object addresses, to the state off. Now, what those IOAs map to exactly depends on the configuration file, in the substation environment. And Indestroyer creates those telegrams based on its own configuration. And here's a dummy example, not one actually recovered. There's a station IP and a port. There's a process to kill. So this is a process of the legitimate SCADA application running in the environment to avoid potential conflict. It supports console output, also logging, as you can see on the right. And this illustrates how the operation can work. So for example, it's sending off commands to a range of IOAs from 10 to 15. And now let's analyze Indestroyer 2. So comparing it to the first version, there was a lot of code similarity, and we can say that it evolved from the same source code. The notable differences in architecture are that Indestroyer 2 was self-contained in a single executable, whereas the original was a modular framework, and it only implemented the IEC 104 protocol. The configuration, in this case, was embedded. So that means that for deployments with different configurations, the attackers would have to recompile it each time. We analyzed 2 samples with different configurations. Both of them appear to be compiled on March 23rd. But that's just the compilation timestamp. As Victor mentioned, the attackers had been planning this attack months ahead. And now I pass the word to Anton to walk you through the details of the config.
Thank you. So the new configuration format is stored as a hard-coded string. So Destroyer 2 is able to communicate with multiple devices at once. One sample that we analyzed contains 3 such IP addresses, and other sample contains 8. So this is example of the configuration. You see IP address, port number, range mode, but it's not used in the samples. Name of legitimate process to terminate, and then it renames the file in order to disable or disable the execution to prevent automatic execution of this software. And then there are these IOAs. In one sample, we found 110 IOAs. In other sample, we found 68 IOAs. And the configuration, it's really similar to previous one, but it's just stored in a different format. You have the same values here. On the screen, you can see packets sent by industrial malware, and it's dissected by Wireshark. The malware, it generates this packet on the fly, and the most important values, you can see it's a double command. It sends IOA, and the command is off. And it's important to know that it does not exploit any vulnerability at all. It just uses protocol in the way that it was designed to use. And if we convert the call configuration in human readable format, we can see that it sends execute off commands to these specific IOAs. So what these IOAs do, it's really hard to find out because you have hundreds of these IOAs. And IOAs can be different from industrial side to industrial side because it depends on equipment, and on settings, and so on. However, if you Google some specific IOAs that are used in Destroyer, you may stumble upon documentation from ABB, and in this documentation it says some of these IOAs, they belong to circuit breaker failure protection, so it disables this protection. When we compare code of old Destroyer to a new one, we can see a lot of similar string constraint and similar code fragments. When we compare output, console output, it's a bit changed too. Before it was more verbose, it was clean and even colorful, and now they're using some codes instead of text. Similar to in Destroyer 1, in Destroyer 2, in this attack, they deployed Vipers in order to make recovery more difficult. So what malware they use? Together with Destroyer, they use KD Viper. It's a Viper for Windows, but for Linux, they use additional Vipers called OrgShred, SoloShred, AwfulShred. And OrgShred is a worm that tries to connect multiple servers within network, and then it runs Viper. This is timeline of incident. The attackers used a scheduled task in order to execute malware, and that's how we know exact time when operators wanted to perform this attack. At first, they deployed the malware, then they create scheduled task, and on this time, they wanted to execute in destroyer, and 10 minutes later, they wanted to execute Viper. In addition to scheduled task, we can see that Linux Vipers, they are using Chrome, and in this Chrome, they also set a specific time. And these Vipers, they are executed based on the operation system used, either Solaris or Linux. The Viper itself, KD Viper, is relatively simple. It just overwrites files with zeros on disk C and other disk, and then it makes computer unbootable by corrupting partition table. So let's talk about defense. I'm going to walk you through detection opportunities you can use. First of all, today we will release pickups that we captured. These pickups contain network traffic produced by Indestroyer. And in addition, we publish a snort rule. The idea behind this rule is to you have to identify IOAs that are most important for your environment, for example, failure protection, and then you modify the rule, and then you can use it. There are few limitations of this approach. First of all, it's not always possible to monitor network traffic in this kind of environments, and also it's hard to identify these IOAs. And other limitation is that when a rule is triggered, it's probably too late. And that's why we suggest you to monitor other events, such as lateral movement via impact. Impact is an open source framework. The implementation of various network protocols in Python, and there are tools implemented on top of this protocol. They are used for remote execution, so for lateral movement, and it's heavily used by Sandworm, especially VMA exec. However, we can detect it based on command line, because the command line used by impact, it contains timestamp and other elements, and these elements are always the same. Also, you can try to detect metapredator. They are using metapredator payloads, reverse TCP, reverse HTTP. It's so-called load maze loader. For this, you can use any modern endpoint protection. Next one, they're using custom PowerShell script in order to push scheduled task via group policy. And for that, you can check out Mitre attack page when they suggest monitor some specific event IDs.
Okay, thank you, Anton. So let's wrap up. Here's some further reading for you, some really good write-ups, and you'll find the links also in the slide deck that we shared online. A couple of finishing sound bites. So It's really good that both of the versions of Industry failed to achieve their goals, but I'd be really careful in evaluating their success rate. The threat shouldn't be hyped, but also should not be downplayed or underestimated. The threats are serious, but they can be thwarted with proper security measures. Thank you. That's it.